Welcome to the Tips for Homeschool Science Show, where we're breaking down the lofty ideals of teaching science into building blocks you can use in your homeschool. I'm Paige Hudson, and for Season 5 of this podcast, we're answering your questions about teaching science at home. Let's dig into this week's question. Should I read science aloud? Ideally, we don't want to be reading our kids' textbooks aloud to them in high school. But how and when do you make that transition from reading aloud to your students to having them read their science materials on their own? Like most things in homeschool, there's no clear cutoff or age range. But there is a natural progression, and that is what we are going to discuss today. Let's dig into today's question. First of all, let's address the when should you stop reading aloud to your kids? The answer is never. Read aloud those great novels to them as long as they will let you do so. Because reading aloud to your kids is something you should do early, often, and as long as they want you to. Reading aloud to our children for at least 15 minutes a day has actually been proven to benefit their brains in a multitude of ways. And I'll put a link to a few articles about this in the show notes. But reading science aloud to them is a bit different. At what point are they ready to start reading and learning rather than listening and learning? So there is a point at which our students can take over the reading reins of their science education. And this point is different for every child, and it really depends upon their reading abilities and their comprehension skills. So let's talk about the typical progression for reading science. There's a natural path that you can take to transition from reading science aloud to your students to them reading their science materials on their own. So let's look at those steps. The first step is to read aloud to them. In the beginning, your students are working super hard on learning how to read. All that decoding is hard work. So, to allow them to enjoy science, we read science aloud to them. At this point, your students can comprehend a lot more than they can read. And by reading science aloud, they can learn about the subject at their level without having to struggle with the act of reading. After you finish, you'll discuss what you read with them, then ask them to narrate or give them a summary of the passage. We chatted about how this works in episode 78. But you can expect to be reading science aloud for most of the early elementary years. Step 2, they read with you. So the second step is a transitional one that takes you from point A to point B. When your students are reading fairly well, you can have them read all or part of their science with you. In our homeschool, we call this team reading. You can switch off paragraphs, or you can just sit with your student as he or she reads the text to you. Either way, by reading science together, you can help them with those difficult and unknown scientific words to make sure that they know what they're reading. Just keep in mind a few things. Make sure that the materials you ask them to read are just below their reading level. And don't force them to read aloud if they don't like to do so. So after you read, you will discuss the materials and still have the students narrate back to you what they've learned, just like you did in the first step. I will say that some children don't need to go through this transitional step. Their reading abilities rocket through the stages, and they want to read science on their own right away. And this is precisely why we always discuss to gauge their comprehension of the materials. Either way, you can expect the transition from step 1 to step 3 to happen in the later elementary years and heading on into middle school. Step 3, you read alone and discuss. So once you're confident that your student can handle reading their science on their own, let them do so. Again, make sure you always make time to discuss the material so that you can verify that they understand what they've read. This discussion time gives you a chance to make sure that they're picking up on all the key points. So you start by reading science to your students. Then, as their reading skills develop, they move through a transitional period where they read the materials with you. As their reading confidence grows, they can read their science materials on their own and discuss it with you afterward. The pace at which your student moves through this progression will differ, but moving through these steps will set them on the path to learning science with confidence. So I trust that by now you understand a bit more about when and how to read science aloud to your students. To see a full transcript of this podcast, along with a few helpful links about the benefits of reading aloud and how to save your sanity during read aloud time, head on over to elementalscience.com/blogs/podcasts/79. That's elementalscience.com/blogs with an S/podcasts/this episode's number, which is 79. Next week, we're going to chat about teaching one discipline or multiple disciplines per year. Until then, I hope you have a great week playing with science.